I'm not even sure even how they went into the design, was the fact that we had the hole in the middle here at the upper lobby that you could look down into the first side. And I just wanted to, and I don't know if anybody wants to elaborate a little bit of that into the design concept of it, but I just want to tell one little story, because one of the jobs that Doug gave me upon my being hired as the operations director was Doug had come up with this idea of us hosting an elder hostel. And I think you had, you had one, I think. You had done one elder hostel. And for those, the elder hostel is basically, it's international traveling educational groups that go around and they travel around the world.
Now called Rhodes Scholar.
Now called Rhodes Scholar. And we still get them here in the museum on a regular basis. In fact, we have one next week coming in. But anyway, we did one here, and Doug got started with it. And when I came in, he says, I'd like for you to kind of take that over and do it. And I said, I had no idea what an elder hostel was.
I think that's what you said. What?
A what, yeah, a what? What is that? Well, this is leading to a cute story anyway. So I did the first one. I fell in love with them, and I did them as long as I was here before I returned back over to the Advocate. And it all fed in. Part of the thing we did when we set up the programs was that we did programming here in the museum, and then we also took them up north too to other locations, and they went out to Cana and other spots. Well, we did evening programming here too to try to keep them busy, and they stayed over at Bridgeport Resort. That's that was the lodging aspect of it. So at night we wanted to give them something to do. So they came over at night. One night I come over here and we're having a presentation on something. I forget what I had set up for them, and we had that open area out there in the lobby. And when the store closed, they always kept the till open and pulled open to the side. So just as most businesses do, they left the till open. And I'm standing in here and organizing and getting stuff all set, and I keep hearing this noise coming from out in the lobby. And I go out there, and these guys that were part of the Elder House, and these Elder House people are great. I mean, that's what makes it fun to work with. They love to travel, they're older, but they just have a great interaction. The guys are over there, and they're betting on dropping quarters down over the side, down into the center, and trying to hit the little trays in there that was coming out from the thing. And I'm over there, I said, what are you doing? And they're just chuckling and back and forth. And one guy said, Charlie's up $1 on me already and everything. He's dropped a couple in there. And I just put that in because that's the one funny story I thought in relationship to the design of the museum when we had that little opening on top, that it also led to a little bit of a little gambling aspect to the museum too. So.
I think that was one mistake. Only one that Ben probably made in this whole museum was that hole in the middle of the floor, because it.
And the concept was that it was like the hold of a ship, where and it gave some light, and also I think it was part of the HVAC design also for air movement. And I suppose we can go to the HVAC for a minute, because that was one of the disasters of our construction. I can remember when we met with Ann at the Neville. Not only did she tell us to build empty boxes, but she said, find an architect who maybe has made prisons. And we all kind of looked at her and said, why? And she said, because you need to have an appropriate HVAC system. And in prisons, they don't have outside vents and things because people can get out. So that was one of the things we tried to build into this facility, was a really top-notch, state-of-the-art HVAC system. Unfortunately, the system that it wasn't Ben's design, it was one of his engineers that he subcontracted to. That design really wasn't, the local contractors weren't able to carry through with appropriately, and they didn't know how to do all of that work. And I don't know if it's still a pain in the side of someone, but when I was here until the day I retired, the HVAC was always a problem. And one of the problems is that within a museum, unlike our houses, we want to keep the temperature constant. So we set it up in my time anyway. It was 72 degrees in here, 365 days a year, 24 hours a day. Didn't matter if it was night, didn't matter if people were in it, whatever, 72 degrees. And the humidity level was also set at, I think it was 50% at that point. And that meant the system really had to work hard. And the real, I mean, we had some real high-tech stuff, you know. The office space had some fancy things in the vents, and no one ever figured out how to use those. But the humidity system would always be, it'd be clicking on and clicking off, and the relays would go out, and so we always had problems with that.
The air handlers.
The air handlers were always, you know, something was not, you know, quite right because of the system, but it's a big system. It's got a giant system down in the back room, and it did its job, but it always was a bit of a headache. But I think that hole was part of that, but the air movement. But it definitely is a much more usable space now that that's closed in, because one of the things that we wanted to do with this room that we're in today and the upper lobby was to be able to do functions, because we knew, I knew from conferences that I had gone to that one of the ways to make money for a museum was to be able to do special events in your facility. We wanted an auditorium with a theater. We didn't have the space, but we did do this room, making it multi-purpose, and over the years it's been used for a variety of things. I'm surprised that the bass tournament doesn't have something going on. I don't think it does. That something going on here that we're paying for, but that's the kind of activity that we wanted to have people use, outside people use this facility for, and we did have many activities where people would come in and rent the space. They'd have caterers come in, and we did our best to keep the food out of the gallery spaces, keep the food in the common spaces, so that we didn't contaminate different locations. But it was a well-used space. We had, anniversary parties, we had wedding parties, we had conferences, and as John mentioned before, the elder hostels, which were really, I would agree with John, they were lots of fun to do. The people we had between 20 and 40 people per unit, and luckily Bridgeport made it possible for us to do that because we needed to have inexpensive housing. So they broke up their suites into single rooms basically for us, and we would have two couples in that suite, and the only problem was that one couple got the master bedroom with the big whirlpool tub, and the other one got the little bathroom, and there was always some little bit of conflict. John would get to his room first, and he'd be assigned the little one, and I'd come and arrive, and I'd be assigned the big one, and John would be wanting to, switch. And we said, no, you're assigned what you're assigned, take what you get. But that worked well. We had people from all over the country come into this facility, and I can remember any number of times people saying to us that they were museum people, and they've been to museums all over the country, and that this museum was right up there with a lot of the other museums that they had been to, big and little, and they were very, very impressed with the professionalism, the way it was set up, and the way we dealt with them.
On that note, my mother and father were on a cruise ship in the Indian Ocean, and they were up in it's called the Trondheim Lounge. It's a cocktail lounge where they go before dinner. My mother is sitting there talking with Dad, and people sitting behind them, she heard the word Sturgeon Bay. So my mother turned around and said, have you folks been to Sturgeon Bay? Oh, we sure have. What a lovely place. And they started talking about it. My mother asked, well, have you been to the museum? Or they asked my mother if she ever been to the museum. And she said, well, yeah, we kind of helped build the museum. And they said that they had been all over the world to museums of this size, and this is one of the finest ones that they've ever been in. So can you imagine that in the middle of the Indian Ocean?
Right.
Around that, so pretty nice.
Yeah, with me, being here on a regular basis, that remains a constant, with people's input, since I do dealing a lot of tours. But primarily, as Doug said, through the elder hostels, because they do come in from all over the country. All over the country. It's amazing the feedback you get from people when they come in. into this facility. One, because they just don't, number one, expect to see a facility of this size in a community of this size. So that initially sets it off, because, you know, I'm sure if you go to Chicago, you expect to see a huge and wonderful museum. But you come here, you don't necessarily expect to see that. But when you come in here and you see the scope and really what's been put together, people walk away repeatedly just stunned by what we have. And that's, I know it's gonna lead into another discussion here, but that's only been expanded with the addition of the tug to it too. So, anyway, that's been.
You know, a place we haven't gone, and John, you mentioned the fountain, but let's go back a little bit to that gallery behind us where the lighthouse exhibit is, and the stories that go along with that, the haunted lighthouses, the way each of those lighthouses was built and why, the fact that Door County has not the most lighthouses of any county in the country, but I believe it's the third most. And you know, the lighthouses are a real asset to what happens in Door County today, and certainly they were instrumental in the shipping and the cargo that went around and through Door County. But we were, as John mentioned, the original thought was to do a replica of the Sherwood Point Lighthouse, of the Lantern Room, and we took a photograph that I think Heidi Hodges did, and we made a big panorama light of that in the back of the light, and hopefully we thought maybe someday we would get the light from the Sherwood Point Lighthouse, and we worked tirelessly with the Coast Guard. And when they closed that facility when it was 100 years old to a manned lighthouse, they went mechanical. And then at some point they determined that they were going to take the lens out. And we were right there. We worked with a lighthouse expert, a lens expert. I can't remember his last name. He was Woody. He came from he had been in the Coast Guard, but he had retired from active service and was a civilian employee of the Cleveland office of the Coast Guard. And he was their lighthouse lens expert. And he came and worked with us. We showed him what we wanted to do. He loved it. And then we went and to move that light out of that lens, the lens out of the light at Sherwood Point, and boy, was that an operation. The Coast Guard did a wonderful, wonderful job. We had a couple active members of the Coast Guard who were then highly involved. Rich Houston, I think, was the main guy. He lives in Sturgeon Bay, but he was working in the Coast Guard office in Milwaukee.
And coincidentally, one of the lead person from the Coast Guard that came here to actually sign it would ultimately become the director of the Maritime Museum, and Bob Desch, because Bob was at Cleveland at the time with the Coast Guard. So the irony came that he obviously came back, and it was a part of the entire process.
That lens was moved here, and crates, and then the Coast Guard came in and helped our volunteers move it into the space in the Lantern Room and light it. And it was, you know, and that's a real feather in our cap that we have that lens. Not only that we have it, but we have it appropriately exhibited and working. It's just wonderful. In addition to the one that is still in Cana Island, and that you know, I'm not sure what kind of shape it's in today, but it's still operating.
Not bad. It's good shape.
And you know, I know Woody was always concerned about leaving that in the tower. He wanted it taken out and put into the downstairs part of the Cana Island Lighthouse, because he was concerned once we opened that tower of all the vibration of people walking up and down the steps. You know, and he was a purist. So to have him work on this light and to train us then on how to keep it clean and to take care of it was a real fun and exciting time in the museum.
John, go down the pond or the fountain or.
So, well, I don't know who can tell the story on that, but that, we put out a proposal too for, I guess, Pete and Jolene Horton were gonna fund it, right?
Yeah, I think that's what prompted it, was they were the ones that supplied.
They wanted to
the
put
money.
some kind of fountain out in the yard, and then we were gonna put out and see if, what designs would come back, and who remembers more about that?
I don't remember too much about that. I was not directly involved with that.
Yeah, well-
Trudy spearheaded that project.
That's right.
But there were some really crazy, I remember drawings
Right.
that were presented to us, and we finally came up with this design, and for years, we had trouble every spring with the.
With the water.
with the-
The other thing we can talk about is obviously the tug, but don't forget the periscope.
Right.
Oh, the periscope, yes,
You
yes.
gotta-
Don't
Yeah,
forget-
it brings
Doug could probably tell the story
Yeah,
better, but
probably
we got
better.
Jerry Wade involved on the board, a friend of mine that lived down on,
Little Harbor?
Little Harbor down there, and we got him on the board of directors, and anybody that has met Jerry knows that he had very, very, very good connections in Washington DC.
Right.
Well, he worked for GI Case, right?
He worked for GI Case, and he was a
In
lobbyist,
Tenneco.
and
Yeah.
he was right up there, and he suggested one day that maybe we could get a periscope here. Well, how the hell you go get a periscope?
He
Well,
did.
He did. He,
From
and
the
supposedly-
Smithsonian. It's still on, is it still on loan?
I have no idea.
I think it's probably still on loan from the, on
I-
permanent loan
Probably.
from,
I think
from the
it's probably
Smithsonian.
a permanent loan. yeah.
One of the things that he always told me, that periscope down there was originally meant to go to Bill Gates's house.
Right, I
Yes.
heard the same thing.
Yes.
yeah.
And he snapped it away, or they snapped it away from there and sent it here, and we had, Tony Campbell was his name, I think.
Yeah, it was Tony
Dale
Campbell
Wiegand-
and Dale Wiegand.
Dale
Yeah,
Wiegand,
Wigan, both, they were both submariners.
submariners here in town, and they helped, oversee how to put it in and what to do and everything else.
Right, we had to get a giant crane and
Yeah.
drop it through the
And I
the
think
top.
Marine Travel brought it back on one of their.
Yes, Marine Travel Up brought it back on one of their empty,
back runs,
Right.
Deliver the travel if they brought
came
it
in a
back.
big wooden box.
Big wooden box, but that's kinda interesting.
Big
We
wood
have a
box,
periscope.
yeah, those guys helped because we had to get nitrogen, we had to find nitrogen to basically pump into the periscope, because
Yeah.
I think that's what helps keep it, clear and, keeps moisture down, whatever inside. It was a
But it was
elaborate
Jerry Waite
process.
that basically got it for us, and, free too, by the way.
Yes, it was a permanent loan, and then we did have to Owen Construction came in and reworked some things for us, and we got a crane and,
The concern was always the penetration through the roof.
Right.
Yeah.
That you were worried.
Yes,
whether it would
absolutely.
leak.
Yeah, exactly.
and it was done perfectly. I can remember we had a little bit of interaction with the Milwaukee, or the Manitowoc Maritime Museum at the time, and they really weren't real happy that we were putting in a periscope, because they have a submarine and they're the submarine museum, but we told them that we were just supporting them. And,
But that's a story of how volunteers have helped.
yes,
Put
absolutely.
this museum together, the Jerry Waite and Periscope story.
Like,
Right.
It shows the diversity. I mean, even now, today, when you go through, you talk about the logistics of that, when you walk through the model room, I mean, the periscope had to come up from somewhere, so it's
Right.
basically going right up through the model room, so.
And we left a little opening in the box that we built
Yeah.
around it, so you could see what it was.
You can see the periscope through, there's a little window there
Right.
that you can actually see the periscope going up through.
Then, the tug story is quite an interesting story. I'll start it off. John did 99% of the work of.
Dan, before you start that, let's reiterate the fact that way back on Henry Isaacson's original drawing, there was a space out here
I was
for a
gonna
floating,
cover that.
for a floating, okay, go ahead.
Any plan that we had, we always had a picture of the tugboat, a picture of a boat being a permanent display.
Right.
So,
Floating exhibit.
anyway, I'll come back to that, but John comes to me one day and says, gee, I think I can get the tug back from, I forget who. Andres, and I said, well, what's it gonna cost, John? Well, it's not gonna cost anything, and I said, well, what's it gonna cost to put back into shape? Correct me if I'm wrong, John, you told me $20,000 or thereabouts to put it back in shape, 30,000.
Could be.
And I said to him, well, it's a no-brainer, we can get the Hayes boys to pay us that much if we gotta scrap it. So John went forward and got the tug, and then we had a problem where we're gonna put it. And just to show you how these little things that you do in government over the years, lo and behold, of course, Selvig's paid rent, the fireboat paid rent, everybody's paid rent, and we went to the city council and says, we've always planned on having a floating exhibit. Here's the maps, or here's the plans that shows you back 10, 15, 20 years ago that the floating exhibit was meant to be there. So basically, they gave us a spot to put it for eternity, I think. And then John took hold and pushed the renovation of the tug, and take her from there,
Well,
John.
It goes back to the John Purvis was originally purchased by my grandfather in 1956. It was the Butterfield back then, and he ran it his fleet for several years, and then it was sold to several different companies, and it finally ended up, that was after his death in 1970, but it finally ended up with Canoni Corporation, and then Canoni sold it to Andre Inc. And the Andres were very close friends of my parents. In fact, they bought a condominium for my parents down in Florida. We had known their family for years. They were in the transportation and construction business. And they had two sons that were in that, both Stan Jr. and Phil Andre. And when I was down in Florida after we had been out a night of carousing with Phil and myself, we came back and we were having a nightcap, and I said, you know, Phil, if you ever decide that you want to get rid of the Purvis, I said, give me a call, because you could donate that to our museum. And he just kind of laughed and said, well, I don't know, we'd maybe sell it to you. And I said, no, you'll donate it to us. So that was, it was 2 years before I got the next phone call from Phil at my office, and he said, are you still interested in the Purvis? And I said, well, I think so, but I want to come and look at it and see what kind of shape it's in. So he said, well, it's at the dock here. We haven't used it in the last 3-4 years. Why don't you come on over and take a look at it? So I'm trying to think of who was on the plane. I know it was myself and Bob Perlowitz. And I don't know if Brian came along or not.
I think Brian may have gone.
He might have.
Yeah.
We took
Yeah, I think I heard it, Brian.
our company plane and we flew to Muskegon, Michigan. We went down and surveyed the tug and looked at it, and my God, when my grandfather operated it, you could eat off the floor of the engine room. I mean, it was immaculate. Now it was a total disgrace, and I mean, it was just terrible. And I remember we toured the engine room, then we went up to the pilot house, and I was standing up there and I looked at Bob Perlowitz and I said, well, Bob, I'm not gonna take this unless you tell me that you will be in charge of the restoration of the tug. And Bob, I remember he kind of looked at me like, you gotta be kidding me. And I said, what do you think, Bob? Are we gonna take it or not? And he said, well, I guess so. So the decision was made. We decided we'd bring it back to Sturgeon Bay, make it a floating exhibit. And so I got a call. We had to do the paperwork, and we got the donation to the museum, and they got their letter for the taxes. And so then I got a call from Phil, and he says, well, the tug's already, they had to take some items off of it. They had a second pilot house on top that they used when they were pushing larger barges. So they removed that and a few other items. And he called and he said, well, it's all ready for you to come and get. And I said, I'm not coming and getting it. You're going to tow it over here. So he said, well, I guess I can do that. So they towed it from Muskegon. That's about 160 miles, I think. Brought it up here, brought it into Sturgeon Bay, and we first took it over to Bay Ship and laid there for a few days. And then we brought it over to our yard over at Roan Salvage Company, and we had to put a barge in between the dock wall and the tug to get it out far enough. It drew 13 feet of water, which was quite a bit. So it sat there for basically 5 years while we did the restoration on it. So Bob kind of put a crew together, and then we got more volunteers, and so the story went. But I was down in there every day that they worked on it to find out what they needed or what we could do or what Roan needed to do to help with it. But first thing they wanted to do was get the blue paint off of it. Bob wanted to see the red on there, so. Anyway, we got it back, and we had it, we were chipping the paint off, we worked on that. And we got a real nice donation from a neighbor of mine for the couple $100,000 to dry dock the tug. So we took it over to Bay Ship, and we had it in dry dock, sandblasted the hull. We removed the shafts and welded up the overboard discharges and made it watertight so that it wasn't gonna sink here at the dock because of a bad sea chest. And of course, propellers we took out and had those cleaned up, and they're out in front of the museum now. But anyway, so we finally finished it, and we towed it over here to the museum, and I guess I heard at our board meeting last night that they've already had over 39,000 tourists go through it, and it's brought in some $115,000 or $120,000 in monies for the museum. And I can remember that Jeff Weberg was not real happy when I decided I wanted to bring this to the museum. Do you remember that, Dan?
Yes.
He was kind of against it. He said, "You'll never make any money. It's gonna cost the museum money." He was just not happy about it, so I'm real happy that we are being able to show a profit with it every year and help the museum out.
I think, John, it's important when you talk about the people who did the work on that tug, that you alluded to it, but every one of them put in time as a volunteer. You know, nobody got paid to do the work other than when it was over at Bay Ship and being worked on by professionals over there. But the people, the men and the women who worked on that tug, did a phenomenal job and really brought it back to what it was when your grandfather had it.
I can't remember the names of I'd be omitting somebody
You would.
if I tried to.
We both would.
And I think there was, well, probably over, 200, 300, 400 people that at one time maybe put their hands on it. And
There probably are. Of course, out here at the museum, we kind of pay tribute to those that lasted. Remember, this.
Go ahead and explain what happened. I think that's a fantastic story and just the
Well,
luckiest thing that ever happened.
I believe what you're talking about, Dan, is up in the pilot house, of course, the wheel that you had built, by the way. Talk about another
Okay,
volunteer doing
yeah.
something, but Dan built a beautiful new wood wheel. There was a steel one on there when we brought it back, and of course, the original wheel was a big wooden wheel. So Dan put one together for us, and it's up in the pilot house, and the tug faces kind of northwest, I would say. And it just so happens that they had the binnacle and they had a magnifying glass that was used to enlarge the letters or the numbers on the compass. And that was set at such a degree that in the afternoon, when the sun got up to a certain height, that sun would shine in through that magnifying glass and onto the wheel. And it actually burnt, started, I don't think did
Yeah,
it
it
start a
didn't-
fire, or
No,
it's?
I don't think it ever started a fire, but it definitely, I mean, it left burn marks.
There's
In
burn
fact-
marks,
In
yeah.
fact, most people, when they walk up during a tug tour now, come up and say, "Gee, these guys must have smoked up here." And to be honest with you, you gotta tell them the story. But the interesting, adding to that, to what John's saying, is that because this happened in the wintertime, when nobody really was on board, I'm sure Bob went on and double checked to see everything was okay. But he didn't go up there and move the wheel or anything. The wheel just sat there for an entire winter. So if you follow the wheel along, you'll see these burn marks that just basically go down. So in essence, it's just following the sun as it falls slower and slower and slower in the sky, going through that magnifying glass. So that's why you'll see these notches as you go down with these burn marks. It's really kind of fascinating. People can't believe it when you tell them.
Well, the way I heard the story, that you were on the tug at 5 or 6 o'clock at night doing some photo ops for somebody or some advertising or something like that, and he smelled smoke. And he started looking around for the smoke, and they went up into the pilot house, and that's how they discovered it.
And they very well might have. And I'm
Yeah.
sure there was smoke that came up from the pilot house.
Because
you can
there's
see from
marks
the
there
burn.
that happened like 5 or 6 or 7 days or in a row as the sun.
Oh, it was a longer period of time
Okay,
than that, yeah,
but
because
they
there's a
smelled
lot of
smoke
marks.
that night and found out about it, and then they
Yeah.
corrected it. But if you can imagine, you look at that, and that's not too far away from being a full-fledged fire. That would have taken the dugout,
Well,
because that's all wood up there and everything, and.
When you look at what those volunteers did and how they brought that tug back to,
Go ahead and explain what happened. I think that's a fantastic story and just the
Well,
luckiest thing that ever happened.
I believe what you're talking about, Dan, is up in the pilot house, of course, the wheel that you had built, by the way. Talk about another
Okay.
volunteer doing
Yeah.
something, but Dan built a beautiful new wood wheel. There was a steel one on there when we brought it back, and of course, the original wheel was a big wooden wheel. So Dan put one together for us, and it's up in the pilot house, and the tug faces kind of northwest, I would say. And it just so happens that they had the binnacle, and they had a magnifying glass that was used to enlarge the letters or the numbers on the compass. And that was set at such a degree that in the afternoon, when the sun got up to a certain height, that sun would shine in through that magnifying glass and onto the wheel, and it actually burnt, started, I don't think it, did
Yeah,
it
it
start a
did.
fire, or
No,
it's?
I don't think it ever started a fire, but it definitely, I mean, it left burn marks.
There's
In
burn
fact-
marks,
In
yeah.
fact, most people, when they walk up during a tug tour now, come up and say, gee, these guys must have smoked up here. And to be honest with you, you gotta tell them the story, but the interesting, adding to that, to what John's saying, is that because this happened in the wintertime, when nobody really was on board, I'm sure occasionally, Bob went on and double checked to see everything was okay. But he didn't go up there and move the wheel or anything. The wheel just sat there for an entire winter. So if you follow the wheel along, you'll see these burn marks that just basically go down. So in essence, it's just following the sun as it falls slower and slower and slower in the sky, going through that magnifying glass. So that's why you'll see these notches as you go down with these burn marks. It's really kind of fascinating. People can't believe it when you tell them.
Well, the way I heard the story, that you were on a tug at 5 or 6 o'clock at night doing some photo ops for somebody or some advertising or something like that, and they smelled smoke. And they started looking around for the smoke, and they went up into the pilot house, and that's how they discovered it.
And they very well might have, and I'm
Yeah.
sure there was smoke that came up from the pilot.
Because there's marks there that happened like 5 or 6 or 7 days or in a row as the sun.
Oh, it was a longer period of time
Okay,
than that, yeah,
but
because there's
they
a
smelled
lot of
smoke
marks.
that night and found out about it, and then they
Yeah.
corrected it. But if you can imagine, you look at that, and that's not too far away from being a full-fledged fire. That would have taken the dugout, because
Well,
that's
when
all
you-
wood up there and everything, and.
When you look at what those volunteers did and how they brought that tug back to
It's great,
1956, I guess, when Cap put it into the Rowan Steamship Company, it's just amazing. You can go back in there, and they took every deck plate off the engine room floor and cleaned out the bilge. They found all kinds of stuff in there, wrenches and all kinds of tools, but they cleaned that all out and then painted that, put all that back together. The electrical panel, which is just unbelievable when you look at that, what they did to clean that up and paint the tanks. They went way behind the big tanks are 50,000 gallon on the second floor there, and guys were back in there crawling on their stomachs to get it painted. But yeah, we did have a female on there, Susie.
Well, we should
and-
mention Sue Bastian. 'cause
Yeah,
I
Sue
think-
Bastian, and
Yeah.
she worked steady the entire time with the major crew on that tug until it was finished. I have to say, even my wife Sandy went down, she painted the ceiling in the gallery. I was just chipping paint on the floor by the furnace, so everybody got a chance to do a little something with the tug.
I can remember when that process was going on. At that point, I had retired or resigned from being the director of the museum and had moved to being the curator. Another story that happened in the hardware store, if I remember correctly, that Christine Randall our first curator, had resigned because she was moving out of town, and we had notices out to all the appropriate places to get a replacement for her, and I made the mistake one day of stopping on the way home from work to get some parts for my gas grill, and Dan grabbed me and said, well, we don't really need somebody that's trained in all that stuff. We just need somebody that knows about the maritime history. And we had if I remember correctly, a heated discussion, Dan, about the type of person we really needed to be the curator of the
I don't know
museum.
if it was heated, I don't think.
And I think in closing, I said, well, maybe I'll just apply. And you said, well, go right ahead. And I went home and I talked to Barbara and I said, that might be fun to be the curator as opposed to the fundraising person and all that stuff. And she said, well, do you want to do it? And I said, yeah, I really would. And I said, but it's going to be a cut in salary and, pay. And so I came back in, and I think it was a Wednesday morning, and I came into the executive committee, and I said, I think I want to change jobs and go to be the curator. And you guys all sat and looked at me and kind of said, are you smoking something? You're drinking? What's wrong? And I said, well, I think that you only raise money and you do that part of the job for so long, and at some point you get tired of it. And I said, if I keep doing this for another year, it's probably going to be time for me to leave, and I'd rather do something fun and do that. So he said, okay. And John was the operations director at that point, and before I made the decision, I think before I went to the executive committee, I went into John and I said, John, how about if I become the curator and you become the executive director? And the poor man went white and said, whoa, wait a minute, who's going to do the fundraising? And I said, oh, we'll hire somebody to do that. You're going to basically keep doing the same things you're doing. And he said, oh, all right, I'll do that. So that was when we made the change. And so I became the curator, and I was the person in charge of watching over that tug. And I tried to stay away from it because it was a thing in motion, and you didn't want to get in the way because it was well-oiled and working perfectly. But Bob would come into my office and he'd say, Doug, he said, we don't have a da-da-da-da-da. We need a brass something to go someplace. They took those things off before they brought it to us. We need something. And so we'd go online. We'd find things on Amazon. We'd find things all over the place. Or Bob would call and say, I'm at an auction someplace and I can find this. Can I buy it? I said, go right ahead. We'd figure out where the money'd come from. But it was a lot of people and a lot of interaction to make that work. And it did.
Yeah, Bay Ship was a big help too in that dry docking. They could have charged us a lot more. They didn't charge us for lay days or a lot of things. So there were a lot of people that contributed to the restoration of the project. But by gosh, it sure turned out well.
Yes.
Just from a
Bill
personal
Arter, have we almost hit every subject you think we should?
I think so.
I got one other thing though.
Well, I put a lot of questions on there. I think you're hitting all the topics, especially the synergy of the volunteers and all their time and development and whatnot. We touched on a tug, we touched on a building, we touched on the architectural, we touched on all the fingers that got into this thing. So yeah, I think we're pretty well hitting it. There's only one subject that really didn't come down yet. We touched on it, but really didn't expand it to it. There was a groundbreaking ceremony that went really well. If you could talk about the feelings of the people during the groundbreaking ceremony and their expectations, and then also as contrasted, or at least to complement the feelings of the people during the final, during the grand opening ceremony, that would really be helpful. Just what was the feelings of the people?
I don't really remember a whole lot. I got one other subject to touch on.
Yeah,
Go ahead, John.
just mentioning what Bill's going, but I'm just so I don't forget the thought at this point. But we talk about the grand opening. Remember when we had the grand opening, we had an open house to the community that basically everybody could come in, correct?
Right.
Everybody came in. And one of the stories that I think came off of that event more than anything else may have been the circumstances with the Elba. Because I think at the time, the way I remember it was the Elba at that time was we did not muffle the horn on the muffle when we initially had the open house. So people are going in, and of course you can imagine the number of people that were in, for this event to come and see this brand new museum. and stuff. And of course, kids, you always got to pull on the horn of the elbow and stuff like that. And I don't know if you want to elaborate on it a little bit, but I know that we were basically blasting people out of that gallery. I mean,
Yes, and I can't remember, we tried a variety of things to muffle it, but a lot of them shot out across the gallery because of the pressure of that horn.
I just want to touch one subject, since we're now aware of Doug's input into this whole situation was fantastic. John, if you can, but I will, but you started out why we had the executive committee formed.
Well, there's probably several reasons.
Well, one of the big
but-
reasons was to
Oh,
get Doug and the signs downstairs and Doug's procrastination on the signs and the boards with names on them and all that. It seemed forever to get them up. But
yeah, there were certain things that we had trouble with Doug, we'd have to meet in privacy with Doug not around, and with Dan and I and whoever would talk about how are we gonna get these things done. And Doug's always telling us, yeah, it's gonna get done, I'm working on it, but doggone it, Doug, it took a couple of years on some things.
It did, and
Thank God we finally got the canoe out of there. That was one of them, but, so anyway, we did start having these, executive committee
Wednesday
meetings,
morning.
we called them, but it was really a good way to, get the small group together. Well, anyone was invited, but it turned out to be a small group. Basically, at that time, nobody was coming down, I don't think, from the northern group, but it gave us a chance to meet with Doug, talk to Doug, find out what was going on, because like you say, we were growing, we didn't really know, we were asking questions and
yeah,
trying to.
one of the hard parts of being the director here, it's probably not unlike any other nonprofit in the country, but we had a board of 18 people, and one of the things that I worked very hard on as we developed the board was to get people who were strong leaders into that board, leaders in all different areas and for different reasons. And that's an important thing for a nonprofit board, because you need the movers and shakers of a community on your board to help with funding, with help with interactions with people, to all kinds of things, and the expertise that they bring to the table. But on the other hand, those strong people each have an opinion. And, and I can think about the days when 2 or 3 board members would be in my office, and John would be telling me that I should be doing one thing, and Dan would be telling me something else, and Louis would be coming in and saying, no, and neither of them are right. And you had 18.
I didn't do that.
No, you didn't, John.
I didn't.
18 bosses, all of whom were pretty independent, strong individuals, and which causes you got to wait what you do, how you do it, and who you can make angry at you and still keep your job. I can remember a number of times coming to your office, John, and sitting down in your office and say, "What the heck is going on?"
Mm-hmm.
And you would say, "All right, here's the deal." And we'd work things out and move along. But I think probably one of the important changes that was made was when we moved to have the operations person take on a lot of the daily operations, because running a museum on a day-to-day basis takes a lot of time. And if you're also still in that mode of trying to raise enough money to finish off the debt and build an endowment and all that kind of thing, there's
have many hats,
only so
Doug.
many hats
I
and
think-
time.
Well, and that,
You had a board that was still finding its way as far as a board and trying to.
Definitely.
That's
Yeah,
right.
and a lot of different, I think a lot of different ideas and opinions, and sometimes you had maybe 20 opinions instead of with 18 members, but.
And sometimes we had a lot of concurring and going on. I think
But it was a struggle to bring that together, and that was
Right.
something that.
And I think the executive committee, although there were days, and there were days when I would argue with you and have different feelings or suggestions, those were interesting times, because it was a good interaction and dialogue that I was able to have with really the key members of the board, in what needed to be done, so that I could, as you would say, more focus better on the things that you guys thought were important, and I could then, at the same time, share my feelings or thoughts about the things that were important that you might not know about, so that we could work more easily through rocky times.
I think since we're coming close to the end, I think.
Let's just make one
I
comment.
got
You know,
one other-
having been on the board for some 20-some years, I think the one thing that we've learned, have learned to do, Doug, is not to micromanage. And that's hard to do at first. And
Oh, yeah.
You happen to be the target.
The target.
But then later on, we've learned that, and you know, that's why we hire someone, that's why we
Right.
pay these people.
I can remember one of the first things that happened after I was hired. I can't remember exactly when it was, but we were in the process of, we didn't have a lot of money. We juggled paying our bills. We tried to make sure important things got paid on time, and we did work through that. We never were late on getting things out. But Dan came to me one day and said, you know, maybe what we should do is like what we do on the county board, and you should bring all of the bills to the board, and we should go through them and determine, you know, give you okay to hire, you know, to pay them and all that. And I looked at Dan and I said, listen, I said, you hired me to run the museum. You gotta let me run it.
So I
And
still think we should have done that.
Anyway, we'd have had it.
But
Anyway,
it's true.
since we're close to closing, I'd like to make, and I'm gonna put Bill Harder on the spot here just a little bit. When we started this process out, and there was so many volunteers, you can't name them all, but us five were certainly part of it. We were something like, I'm gonna say something because of the notes we signed for the, Hope and that, we're something like $120,000 in debt with our name on it. Bill, what is the museum bottom line net worth?
Well, our
right?
net worth right now is about 2.8 and change.
I think that says it all.
Yeah.
2.8 million.
And that doesn't even include the accounting for the artifacts. If
Okay.
we did that, can you imagine what some of these artifacts would be worth?
Yeah, just a fantastic, and it was done through volunteers, all, you know, I know
That's
Doug,
that's not the real big question though. So would you, each of you look over your shoulders figuratively, for the last 20 years since the building was built, the museum was created here in Sturgeon Bay, and each of you express what benefit was brought to the community? What were the benefits overall that were brought to the community that this facility, this building here in Sturgeon Bay, the existence of the museum, what synergy did it create? What were the benefits?
I'll start with that. I've been involved with a lot of fundraising and building things over my career. You know, I started out as in education as a teacher, and then ended up going to an independent school in New Jersey for 10 years, and then one in Beaver Dam for 4 years as a fundraising person and raising money for operations and buildings and things like that. When this facility became a reality, and I look at that then and look back at that, or every day I drive by and see the structure, or see what's happening at Cane Island or Gills Rock, but particularly this facility, it makes my heart feel good, because I had something to do with that. And I say something. I wasn't, you know, there are a lot of other people that made it work. This facility in particular, Door County Maritime Museum as a whole, has a giant impact on Door County. It has a giant impact on the tourism of Door County, the economy of Door County, and probably most importantly on holding the history of Door County. And when we started, our mission, and I think this mission hasn't changed very much anyway, the mission was to have tell the maritime history of Door County and the Great Lakes, because we wanted to, because the Great Lakes impacted what happened here. But the maritime history of Door County impacts probably 75, 80% of the people who still live here, even people who have come new to Door County in the last 10 or 15 or 20 years. But the impact of the history, the maritime history that has had on people who live here, and being able to hold that someplace. If this facility weren't here, I would guess that there would be something. The Door County Historical Museum is a wonderful, wonderful museum, small museum. But we'd have a little wing of the maritime. I mean, when we started to do this, we went to the Historical Museum and we said, all right, you guys have some stuff that's maritime related. Do you want to keep it? And a lot of their collection that was maritime moved over here. Because they didn't have to hold that and have that little niche. And that's what it would have been, because they're telling the story about the cherries and the canning and the orchards and the farming and all the other parts of the, the schools that have to do with the county. We're maritime, and the maritime history of this space is huge and impacts any number of people. If we weren't here, if this facility weren't here, Gills Rock weren't here holding the fishing part in the lighthouse at Cana, what would happen to all of that history? It would be in our brains, in our scrapbooks, in our attics, and as we die, and we're going to, all of that history kind of disappears. Maybe our children hold some of it, but it doesn't all get transferred that way. John's daughter has some of that history, but she doesn't have it all. And my kids do, and Dan's kids do. But wow, it's just an amazing story that's told and is held here in a space that will go on forever, I hope.
Well, I couldn't agree more with you. When I think about my grandfather, first John Rowan, starting his first little operation in 1919, basically, and then ending up here in Sturgeon Bay with a shipyard, and then Rowan Transportation. My father started Rowan Salvage Company. I had a lot to take care of. In my personal opinion, I've always loved history, and I really felt that it was important that we get something like this up and running to preserve it, Doug. I think you hit it right on the head.
I mean, look at all of the things that are the stories that are told here that are no longer. I mean, when you open the windows up and look out on the inner harbor, Peterson Builders isn't there anymore. Ellsworth and Carla, Fred Peterson, going back, Palmer Johnson, is leaving. The shipyard across the bay is now not a shipyard anymore. Bay Ship is still here, but Christie Corporation and Sturgeon Bay Steamship and Sturgeon Bay Boat Works, all of those things are gone. And you see a picture in a bar, every once in a while they look great, but the story's not there other than a few pictures. And this is what.
Well, that was one of the reasons, Doug, that 2 years ago I put together that project at the City Hall with the shadow boxes. I don't know if have you seen those? Right. Because all of a sudden I feared what was going to happen with the history of these places. Eventually Rowan Salvage may be gone, but you had Sturgeon Bay Shipbuilding and Dry Dock, Christie Corporation, Peterson Builders, Palmer Johnson's now on their way out. They're all going to at some point probably be gone, and I thought, how is anyone
going to change?
How are they going to remember these
right. companies
and what they were and what they provided to the community? So you're right. This has been our job to do this, and it feels like we have to give back to the community, and I think all of us have done that.
I see another aspect of this too. When you guys were talking about work on the tug and people would have the coffee and donuts that were there, but this whole social aspect of volunteerism, I think, is important. Just the very concept of volunteering involves that type of a social contact with each other. And I think that's something else that happens with an organization of this size, is you do get quite a number of volunteers that will come in and do things in various aspects. And then they have contacts with each other, And that spills over into just the general quality of life within the county itself. I don't think we touch on that much or realize how important that really is, but I think that's another thing that the Maritime Museum does bring.
I was just gonna say that, you know, since I interact a lot with the tours that come in here and stuff like that, I think the one thing this building does, and you guys eloquently have already stated one aspect of that, is in terms of those people that come in here, anybody who lives in a community has a tendency to take for granted what they have. I think you get to the point where we see people that still come in the museum who've lived here for 15, 20 years, have never been inside this museum. And I think part of it is just our human nature. I think human nature has a tendency to do that, that people who live here have never gone up onto Washington Island or whatever. The thing is, this place helps serve as a reminder of that physically, even if they're not inside, or make that trip to come inside. Hopefully they'll be driven to come inside and want to visit and absorb some of that history and stuff. But at the same time, for those visitors that come here, we're basically helping to spread that. You know, we're spreading that out. I know just from experiences of people that come in here and go back and they talk about how, you know, they didn't realize this was up here and that they shared that with somebody else. You know, they had to come here because, you know, their neighbors or their brothers or sisters happen to come and make a trip up here. So the important part is that you're here to be able to do that, and hopefully we can continue to spread the message, you know, locally and get more and more people to come and participate. Because that's probably, I hate to say this as being one of the sad parts of this situation, is the fact that a number of people that I come across that really don't understand what you talked about, Doug, and don't understand, you know, the history. They just take it for granted. They take it that that's just what this community is about. And I think hopefully that's part of the mission that we have going on forward, is to basically continue to remind people that this is really what, you know, Sturgeon Bay and Door County are all about. So I think, if nothing else, we're kind of the anchor to that right here.
But isn't it great that people out there that don't come in take it for granted that the museum is here and has that warehouse, that storehouse of information, so that if and when they need it,
Yeah, and
they can get to it.
Sure, I think it's, you know, I'm sure down, if you live in Chicago and you got the Museum of Science and Industry or whatever, people haven't even gone there, but if somebody goes in, you take an immediate pride with having that, even though maybe you've never gone in it. So hopefully that's what people are getting with this, you know, is that same feeling.
I gotta say, you guys have said it all. I'm just here thinking, sitting here thinking, people should realize of the hundreds and hundreds of ideas that we still have. When we ever have a meeting, we got all kinds of ideas. We should be doing this, we should be doing that, we should be doing this, and of course the driving force of why we don't is twofold. And one is the time of people doing it, and then of course money to do some of this stuff. John, you know, just like the dock around the outside of the Purvis, and it's just hundreds of things that we could do, and but we did a hell of a lot, you know, and the people of Door County and Sturgeon Bay should be proud of what it was all about. 98%, except for Doug.
There are some others that got paid.
No, damn it, you've always, many times at board meetings, you know, on your point, Louis, there is a camaraderie within the board with certain people, and, you know, we've been doing this for so long. There's a lot of great suggestions that have come out. But I lost my train of thought on what you had just said. Oh, I think it was, that's a good way to end it. I lost my train of thought.
I got another question.
Should be a ship of thought instead of a train of thought.
I got another question.
Okay.
Part of teaching history and having museums is to pass along to the next generation the value of what we've done. Showing them the history, telling them the stories, telling them what happened and how it was done. Shows them what Mom and Dad did, what Uncle Jack did, and so on. How would you characterize the value of this facility and its exhibits to aid the youth in looking into the future? And maybe some of them took a maritime career into consideration. What do you think impact was on the area's kids in the last 20 years?
I know this is rather blunt, but I don't think it's been too significant. And
I have to agree.
and I think part of that is that's it's partly our fault, and it's partly the community's fault, and it's partly a number of people's fault. I think it's part of our school system's fault, that a lot of times they don't necessarily, understand the importance of the significance, and maybe it's, and on to, and we have great teachers out there, and who dedicate their lives to these kids. But sometimes they don't really understand the full scope of the history and what's going on around them. I would love to get more, I'd like to get the museum more involved in the curriculum of the school systems that are around here. We do get some of the schools that bring kids here and introduce them to the museum. A classic example happened the other day, and this is a great story, and I now share it with every one of my tours that I go along. I had a preschool group come through from St. Peter's School over here, 4-year-olds, okay? They came in, and as leading a lot of tours, I went, oh my God, I got a bunch of 4-year-olds I got to take through the museum. How is this all going to work, And we've all had that if we've had kids and grandkids or whatever. And so, anyway, they came in, and they were the greatest kids. They were. They followed me around like I was a Pied Piper. And we got into the lighthouse room over there, and one little girl stood there, and she stood right at the corner, and she looked at the lighthouse, and she stood there, and she looked at it, and then she raised her hand. And I said, do you have a question? And she said, yes. She said, why is that light blinking? And I said, you know what? That's a really, really good question. I said, because I've given tours for 15 years in this museum, and no one has ever asked me that question before. And I said, you know what? There's a reason why that light's blinking. And I asked her if I tried to engage with them, and they couldn't give me an answer because it was a little over their head. But I do it with adults now, and probably 90% of the adults don't know the answer to that question.
And you are going to tell us the answer, aren't you?
Right. Well, do you know the answer to that
No,
question?
I said,
Yes.
you are going to tell us, you're going to tell us the answer, aren't you?
Well, I'm sure John can give you the answer to that question, right? Give him the answer to the question.
Well, there's different light signals at different
Patterns.
frequencies tell you what the light is.
That's right.
And different colors.
It's got to have a characteristic. You can see it during the daylight. During the daylight, you can identify a light basically by color, when it's painted, by just the surroundings.
And they all look different.
And they all look different, exactly. But at night, you can't. And so what that little girl said right there was very intuitive. I mean, she basically caught on to it immediately. So it's there, Bill. It's there that kids want to be able to absorb some of this information.
I'd respond to that question also, Bill. The education process, I'm obviously an educator from, day one of my career was in education. And I look at this museum as an educational facility in all kinds of ways. When we were maybe 3 or 4 years into the facility being open, one of the things that we talked about doing was to hire. We had a director. I'm not sure if John was as the operations person yet, but I think he was. We had a curator. We had an archivist. We had a store manager and people like that. So the museum was pretty well staffed at that point with professional people and trained people. We talked about hiring an educator at that point. And we actually wrote some significant grants to the federal government for the hiring of an educator. Miriam Erickson, a board member, was a librarian and very, very involved with education and wanting us to be more educational. We worked with, talked to the public schools in Sturgeon Bay, Southern Door, Sebastopol, Gibraltar, about how we could interact more in their curriculum. But what we needed was somebody who would have the time and the expertise to be able to take what the museum had to offer and blend that into what the school system needed. That's a difficult job, particularly if you don't have somebody that is the key person to lead that project. We weren't able to hire that person. But we did do some things to tying things into exhibits. When we did the launching exhibit, we had a booklet for kids. Every kid that came in the door got a booklet. Every school group that came in, each kid got a booklet. And it was a booklet that was designed for fourth grade reading level. And the way we determined that was we wrote the book, figured it out, thought about how we would word things and that, and we took our preliminary copies and we sent them out to a couple fourth grade classrooms. And we had those teachers use those in their classroom, and then they made recommendations to us how we could improve that piece of literature, shall we say. And we did that on a number of occasions so that we had learning materials that were geared toward the classroom. That was a way we could outreach. And then in addition to that, and I think it's still being done in the exhibits that I've been through, we tried to do things that are educational, not just for those of us who are old or middle-aged, but for younger kids. And the touching boxes in the Sea Dog exhibit, the costumes. I know when I bring my granddaughter in, the first place she goes is to that costume area and gets the dog out and dresses the dog, and you know, she loves to do that kind of stuff, and she likes to do the things that she can touch. So that's still part of that is part of the exhibit creation that still goes on. Would I like to have seen and still would like to see that the museum be more involved in the educational process of the school system? Boy, you know, bring it on. I think that would be wonderful, but the only way you could do it would be to have somebody that was dedicated to that on the staff.
It's great.
1956, I guess, when Cap put it into the Rowan Steam.
In the future, we need to have really strong roots and a concentration on an educational program. In order to create an educational program, how do you see it benefiting the community? How do you see this museum and this facility benefiting the kids in the future?
I think it goes back to what I said a couple of minutes ago, is that there's all kinds of ideas out there that we could do. You know, like the person that you wanted to hire, or, you know, and it can all be done, but you gotta have the finances to do it, and I think that's the thing that stopped that idea, is we didn't have enough money to fund it, so you're always gonna have this conflict of all kinds of ideas, but not enough money to take them through.
Sure. You know,
And there's just hundreds of ideas
But you know,
out
Dan,
there.
the times are changing, and these static displays that we have today.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. Yeah.
You know, are fine for people to go back and look at a model or look at some shivs
Oh,
or
you
whatever.
know, we talked
But
about-
today, they want to see the displays. I think these kids are so educated early on computers
Oh,
and screens that
Absolutely, absolutely.
this is where we need to look at for the future, and what we're trying to look at with our new tower that we're talking about trying to build, so.
See, what you gotta do though is, the next generation has gotta step into our shoes. I think you or John is the youngest one here of us, 5 in the board of
But
directors.
you have some younger people on the board
But
now.
that's what you gotta start
know,
doing, is
they're-
you gotta start getting
And that's important.
younger board members
Yeah.
to bring in these younger ideas, but there's all kinds of ideas out there,
Okay,
so.
let me state the question really simply then. Why is it important for this museum to concentrate on educating for the kids?
It's not necessarily important for the kids. It's important to be able to educate and to have interactive and not just interactive exhibits, but to have an interaction with kids, with elementary school kids, with teenagers, with young adults, with senior citizens. You know, years ago, I remember, you know, thinking about trying to do some copying some activities that were done in the Milwaukee Art Museum, I believe it was, where they'd have young adult night, you know, and they'd have, you know, there would be a bar of some sort set up, and it was an after-work activity where the young professionals would come to the museum and hang out and congregate with each other and interact as a social activity, but being in the art museum. You know, it's being able to touch all levels of the community is the important thing in some way, and whether it's an educational, a formal educational program or an informal educational program, or just a way to promote having people use the facility or use the information that is stored in the facility in some way. Could be electronically. I know there's been continuing talk about putting some of the collection into
Kiosk.
electronics and into the, a database of some sort. That was talked about 20 years ago. And again, some of it didn't happen because of money, and some of it didn't happen because of personnel. Because you need to be able to pull all those things together, Dan. You're absolutely right.
Yep.
You have to make, that weighted decision on where's the important thing today.
I think those are the kind of questions that your board of directors should be addressing now, and not, this was, meeting was to say how we got this far, and the future is up to the board coming up. with
I think
what
one
they should do.
comment I'd make is that, and I'm not sure I'm saying this quite right, but in order to know where we're gonna go in the future and why we wanna educate these children is because you need to look at your past and you need to see where you've come from in order to see where you wanna go. I mean, you started off with steam engines, you went to diesel, and now you're jet power. So these kids have to understand part of this history, I think, this marine history, to see where we're gonna go into the future.
And I think that partnership has to be with the schools, to be honest with you, because one trip in here is not gonna do it for a child to come in here and see that. But we can certainly work hand in hand with those. So if we work with the schools, and we do have a few that we work with their curriculum and they bring the kids in here, my hope is that they talk a little bit about that history in this classroom and they get them a little excited about it, so when they come in here, we can share that with them. And we've had experiences where we've had people go in and talk to the class before they come here. That's the kind of stuff we want to do, because then they can in essence, they get an idea of what they want, what they're gonna see, and because sometimes this is just too much and all overwhelming for them at one time to see.
Ideally, the part of the educational program, ideally would be, and I don't know what level of elementary it is now, but you have 1 year there's Wisconsin history, local history, and how much of the curriculum, the current curriculum within the Door County public schools, the Door County private schools, actually incorporates the maritime history of what goes on. And you could expand that to the cherry industry, the tourism industries. Those are the things that ideally would be the curriculum that is taught within that local history or Wisconsin history part of the elementary school. But and I think that the school systems could do that within. I know it's way harder than when I taught 40 years ago, to develop your own curriculum. The state has, you got to do certain things, but I think that there's enough wiggle room that the criteria that the state has could be, that the local history could be used. But again, that takes a lot of work and a lot of time, and the local teachers don't have the, number one, they probably don't have the expertise, the knowledge, the maritime knowledge, nor the time to be able to do that kind of curriculum development. So you got to have somebody that's able to do that.
Yeah.
Just
Bill.
touched on one thing, what type, we've been contemplating significantly connecting with this next generation younger than us, with media that resonates with them, that they connect to. Everybody these days got a smartphone. Everybody these days watch TV. The kids love interactive media and things. Could you all express your opinions on how to attract families, and what type of displays are needed to connect with the next generation that we should consider?
Well, I think, like I tried to say, if you just looked at shipping itself, Bill, and you went back and you looked at the first the steam-powered vessels, and you could take this through all the way up to today. We're talking about LP container ships. They're talking about building several fueling facilities. I think one around Sarnia, and they've talked about one up in Duluth, I think. If you could show them the steam engine, you could show them the diesel engine, and keep walking it through its progression right up to this LP gas, and this is the future. They need to see this is what In fact, there are ships right now, I believe, that China's built that are actually using this propulsion, using this fuel. I think those are important things to teach them.
Bill, I think that's a good question, but I don't think it's one for this little group. I would, if I were your executive director right now and you were asked me that, I would say that information needs to come from our professional staff, wherever that is, my curatorial staff, my exhibit design staff, because those are the people hopefully that have a finger, a handle, an arm on the most logical, modern ways to present history to the population, and where to find that, and how much, and how much time and how much money it's gonna cost to do those things.
I got one more comment to make about that. I think you're right about getting the youth involved in that, but maybe what we really have to do is get the adults involved, so we get some of those people as passionate about the museum as they're passionate about soccer, or something like that. And that's where the problem, and the parents are gonna pass it down to their kids. You can try to jump that generation, but you really gotta get
That's right.
more people involved in their 40s and 50s years old, and everybody's so busy, it's unbelievable. And that's what the biggest challenge is to get. I don't know how we got our group together, but it just went together magically, and I don't know how you do it. It just,
Yeah. Can I make one comment we can splice back in? Rowan Salvage Company was hired by OM Construction to drive the piling here for the foundation. We ordered the piling in May 15th of '96, and we drove 112 wood round treated piles, 25 feet long, and we originally had brought in 5 35-footers for test piles and found we didn't need them that long, so then we purchased the smaller ones. And there was quite a concern by the city that this was a dump, as you talked about, and they thought originally, well, maybe there'd be 1,000, what was it, 1,000, not ton of material to remove total at $5, and then they later found out that there could be oil and a bunch of other things that could be contaminated. They were talking now $40 a ton rather than $5, but that went away. It was mostly dirt that they had to get rid of, and not. But we did, when we were driving, we did, I think, hit a wash machine or something.
It was a refrigerator.
Refrigerator.
Broke 2 pilings, if I remember correctly.
We couldn't quite get in, but, so that's, anyway, that's a story of the piling.
And another point on that, because you mentioned the contamination, we did have, we had to do environmental testing. The EPA or somebody came in and did all kinds of tests out around, particularly because of the co-op. They did find some problems, so we had, I think, out in the parking area, one right outside the front door, and then another one, test wells that were tested for a number of years, and whatever remediation that they did over at the co-op at that point was able to make sure that the where we were was clean. So there was environmental concern and testing done before we got the okay to build here.
My last comment will be, I thought of what I was trying to think of before.
okay.
We go into our meetings, sometimes these board meetings, and you and I'd look at each other and we'd say, we can't always look at what we haven't done. We need to look back on how much we have done, and that's really true, Dan. I mean, we're always wanting to do more here. It's always, it's financial, it's things you've talked about. But when you look back on what this group did to bring this facility here on this spot, it's amazing. It really
That's
is.
why I made the comment here a couple of minutes ago about we were like $120,000 in debt when we started this process, and now we're 2.6 million, you said, or something to that effect. Yeah, we talked about that many times, how we always beat ourselves up at
Right.
meetings and say, we should be doing this, we should be doing that, we should be doing this, and in the ultimate end, we did accomplish a whole lot.
Yeah, thanks.
That should do it, huh?
I think we're good done, guys.
Okay.
I think we're done.
Okay.
Thank you very much for your
You're welcome.
input on this and participation in a tremendous session for 3 hours.
My
Actually,
agent,
you exceeded the Republican national debate duration.
Yeah, but we got.